Hello there, my name is Roger Goff and I'm standing in front of a representation of the Timecott Cemetery in Belgium, which commemorates the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost and surrendered to gain and keep the independence of Great Britain and other countries in the First World War. What I want to talk about today is in fact the EU, which unfortunately, to my way of thinking, has grown out of those two world wars. And I first became aware of this via Sir James Goldsmith, who formed a referendum party, and he said that we were sleepwalking into oblivion. I don't think he's far wrong, and for 20 years I've been trying to do my little piece to do something about it and to maintain the equilibrium that we've got at the moment, or we did have before we were dragged into the EU and democratically. Lots of reasons why we shouldn't be in the EU. First is that we pay £50 million a day, quite a staggering amount, to actually stay in the Union. And another one particularly is the theft of our fishing grounds. There are many, many more reasons why we shouldn't be in there. But Remainers or Leavers, you will have heard the majority of these arguments before. I want to bring some new facts to you that I doubt very much whether you are aware of, and it's concerning one of the most divisive aspects of the EU, and that is what is known as the migrant crisis. Now, this was brought about by Frau Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who decided, seems unilaterally and on the hoof, to invite all migrants from the war-torn country of Syria to come to Germany. And that message was transferred by social media, and that's an important point to remember. The Syrian refugees, migrants, and let's call them migrants for the purposes of this interview, obviously flocked towards Europe upon that invitation. What happened after that is open to conjecture. But because I mention migrants, no doubt I'll be branded racist and a xenophobe, I would imagine. But hear me out, and I think you may find that things are not always as they seem. So the history of the migrants, the invitation, as I've outlined, and the news reached the migrants via social media. And whilst that German invitation appeared humanitarian, generous in the extreme, it was nothing of the sort, because Frau Merkel and her advisors and representatives in the EU failed to extend a duty of care to those migrants. They extended the invitation and said, come on over, but they made no reference as to how they could do that, much less how they could do it safely. And so it effectively drove the migrants into the hands of people traffickers, who were very quick on the uptake to think, no measures have been put in place for these people, we'll do it for them, but for big fat fees. And as we all know, that's what happened. Those fees didn't get them luxury crossings or luxury voyages. They were put on very, very flimsy boats, and as we've seen, sadly, thousands of those migrants on those flimsy boats perished in the Aegean and the Mediterranean Seas. Not just adults who might well have been expected to get across the sea in relative safety, but children as well. Who can forget those heartrending images of children being dragged for the sea after they had drowned? Casualties mounted. In 2015 alone, 4,000 people, it was estimated on the EU's own figures, drowned in the Mediterranean. But despite all these drownings, still nothing was done by the EU or any other agency, and there are a lot of agencies, to counteract these drownings. So, even as a racist and a xenophobe, I was interested in this subject, and I wondered, obviously, why this was happening. It seemed to me that it could have been quite easily averted. And in September 2015, in my hometown of Stroud in Gloucestershire, there was a meeting called to discuss the migrant crisis. Actually, it wasn't called to discuss the migrant crisis, but the measures to be put in place in my hometown to welcome the migrants that eventually reached here and how they were going to be treated in the future, housing and food, etc. But I was still curious as to how this death toll was going to be stopped. So I asked the distinguished panel, one or two were from Oxford University, we were told, and I asked a simple question: how is this death toll going to be curbed? What measures are going to be put in place? And shouldn't they have been put in place before now? That question seemed to nonplus the panel. It seems they weren't interested in that. All they were interested in was what to do with the migrants once they got here. So I never got a satisfactory answer to my question. So my contention was that it was simple to do. As the invitation had been received on social media by the potential refugees and migrants, surely details of how they could be saved could be transmitted, circulated in a similar way. These details could be just pushed out on social media, and the migrants, I'm sure, would have flocked to what I would consider to be the safe idea of forming collection points, particularly in Turkey, who were keen to follow these migrants because there were so many that were migrating to Turkey and they were becoming a problem. So surely if the migrants went to collection centres, they could be identified, their details taken, recorded, and then at the expense of the EU or anyone else who wanted to help, they could be put on chartered planes and they could be flown cost-free to Berlin or wherever else the EU wanted them to settle. Another beneficial aspect of this is that the fees that the migrants, and they were quite large, always four figures, they paid to the traffickers, could be used as a nest egg to begin their life in the West. Even this, it seems, was not thought of. Large sums kept on being paid to traffickers, and nobody, it seems, except the traffickers, were benefiting from this. These rescue missions were not difficult to put together, to mount. In fact, in 1984 and 1991, Israel, in two covert operations, managed to get all Jewish subjects out of Ethiopia who were fleeing there through political and famine, political reasons and famine in that country. Those were covert operations, and they didn't have the extensive money that the EU would have had. And the numbers in those two operations, one called Solomon, the other called Moses, are quite impressive. As the first one, they rescued 14,500 migrants from Ethiopia. And in one instance, they actually packed 1,000 of the migrants into one plane, into one 747. And they were saved. Another example as well was occurred in Denmark and Sweden in the Second World War, when within a week 7,400 migrants were taken from one country to the other, escaping the German advance, and that was obviously at no cost at all. But of course, perhaps the great rescue in modern history was that of Dunkirk, put together by the British Army in a plan by circumstance, which had to be done very, very quickly. It was done on the hoof. But as we all know, there were massive amounts of people rescued from that terrible warfare. So, with innumerable examples of how people could be rescued, it seemed that the EU had no idea or no regard for history. They just let people take their chance with the traffickers. And that, I think, was a huge, huge failing on the part of the EU. So when I distilled my ideas about this crisis, I put it together in a letter to one of my local newspapers, the Western Daily Press, and remarkably, they didn't print it as a letter, they printed it as an opinion piece. So the fact that it was actually printed as an opinion piece meant surely that an editor, probably university educated, was quite prepared to put those ideas into print for his readers. So that to me meant that they at least had some worth. After that, I was lucky enough to hear a serialised version of a book on BBC Radio 4. And that book was a book called Factfulness. And up here on the left-hand side, you might see the legend which says, one of the most important books I've ever read, Bill Gates. And if that was important, that's good enough for me. And the gentleman that wrote that was a guy called Professor Hans Rosling, a man of some international repute, as he put together the humanitarian organisation Médecins Sans Frontières. And he made no bones about it, that these things came to pass. He identified exactly what I had identified, and he too couldn't understand why this had not been put in train. And so if I and an eminent professor can identify these shortcomings, why in heaven's name can't the EU or any other the units that should be busying themselves with this crisis? That's the UN, Amnesty International, a multitude of human rights organisations could have done something, but it seemed that they were disinterested, or were they put off? Were they put off for some other reason? It's difficult to understand why they didn't take action, but that's something I've not been able to understand or discover why. Another thing that Professor Rosling writes in his book Factfulness considers refugees, obviously, but I'd like to read a passage here which I think is very relevant. He too was flummoxed as to why nobody was apparently safeguarding the refugees. And here's what it writes. We soon worked it out. The villains were the cruel and greedy smugglers who tricked desperate families into handing over thousands of euros per person for their places in inflatable death traps. But why weren't the refugees travelling to Europe on comfortable planes or ferry boats instead of travelling over land to Libya or Turkey and then entrusting their lives to these rickety rubber rafts? After all EU member states were signed up to the Geneva Convention, and it was clear that refugees from war-torn Syria would be entitled to claim asylum under these terms. I started to ask these questions of journalists, friends and people involved in the reception of the asylum seekers, but even the wisest and kindest among them came up with no real answers. The reasons why it sounds fantastical they weren't able to get onto planes was a result of a European Council directive that tells member states how to combat illegal immigration. And it meant that when migrants arrived at a port, they had to prove that they had a visa. Well, how could they get a visa? But they were still turned away. Why then must they come in such terrible boats? Actually, EU policy is behind this as well, because it's EU policy to confiscate the boats when they arrive. So boats can be used for one trip only. The smugglers could not afford to send the refugees in safe boats, and our governments claim to be honouring the Geneva Convention that entitles a refugee from a severely war-torn country to apply for and receive asylum. But their immigration policies make a mockery of this claim in practice and directly create the transport market in which the smugglers operate. What a terrible indictment. There is nothing secret about this. In fact, it takes some pretty blurry or block thinking not to see it. That's fairly condemnatory coming from a guy who's a professor. But I could see it as a repeat as well. So why can't the masses of human rights organisations across the world not see it as well? But allied to this was the fact that For one part of the migrant crisis, the EU agreed a written pact with Turkey to give Turkey 6 billion euros. That is a massive amount, 6 billion euros, to try and organise just one part of the migrant crisis. And this was outlined in a Guardian article by Guy Verhofstadt, one of the main movers in the EU movement, and he decried this pact, and he says here it's illegal and betrays Europe's values. Now this is just an extract from this article, which lays out what this was all about. The basic principle of the one in, one out deal on offer is that any economic migrant or Syrian refugee trafficked to a Greek island will be forcibly returned to Turkey. For every Syrian sent back to Turkey from Greece, another Syrian would be accepted by EU countries and distributed under a quota scheme. How that can work for 6 billion euros is beyond my comprehension. How can that cost that? And you'll also note that they didn't send them back to Turkey in a boat over the Mediterranean or the Aegean. They obviously sent them back by some safe means, otherwise a well-prepared boat, or in all probability an aeroplane, a chartered plane. So if they can do that for this, why couldn't they do that for the upwards of 6,000 people that drowned in the Mediterranean? So 6 billion euros, a sizable sum. So what did us, the EU citizens, get for that? It seems that we'll never know, because the European Court of Auditors, in a report which they published last year, they obviously have a responsibility to determine how EU finance is spent. So they approached the Turkish government and said, can you tell us how that first 1 billion euros of the pact that we agreed, how was that spent? And the Turkish government said, I'm sorry, we can't tell you that, because if we did so, it would breach data protection laws. That seems a pretty good excuse to me if you're not spending the money how it should be spent. And as for the other 6 billion euro, the other 5 billion euros, still nobody knows what happened to that. So to my mind, that's a pretty unacceptable state of affairs. Another method of rescuing children and vulnerable people again harks back to the Second World War, and this was one that was instigated in Germany, and that's a system called Kindertransport. And very simply, the authorities in those days saw that young children were going to be vulnerable in the war that could be seen to be coming, and so they were put on transport and brought, very, very many of them, over to Britain. And here they stayed, and they were safe. So why did the EU not see that? That policy actually came from Germany. Okay, Frau Merkel was from East Germany, I know, but Germany nonetheless. Did it not resonate with her? But, this is my final point, I and everyone else who is concerned about the amount of migrancy to this country and other European countries are branded as fascist, xenophobic and racist. We have no say in what happens to those migrants, but the EU does. And what have they done for them? They've done absolutely nothing other than issue an invite. They've allowed over 6,000 people to drown in the Mediterranean, and they still are drowning. So who, I ask, are the racists in this? Thanks for listening. And I would also like to thank Brian Cooke, who did the video here. Thanks, Brian.